Welcome to Nicki Cozy Stories. I'm your host, Nicki. Tonight, we begin a gentle storytelling journey through a beloved classic, The Secret Garden. Long before Mary Lennox ever saw the gray skies of England, she lived beneath a blazing Indian sun. The air there was heavy and warm, even in the early hours of morning, and the great white house where Mary lived stood quiet behind its shaded veranda. Tall palms lifted their feathery leaves above the garden walls, and bright flowers, scarlet and gold, opened their faces to the light. It was a beautiful place, but it was not a happy one. Inside the house, the rooms were large and cool, with wide windows covered by thin curtains that stirred softly in the warm breeze. Servants moved quietly along the hallways in loose white clothing, their footsteps light against the tiled floors. And somewhere, in the nursery, at the far end of the house, lived a little girl named Mary Lennox. People who saw her often said she was the most disagreeable-looking child they had ever known. She was small and thin, with pale yellow hair that hung straight against her cheeks, and a narrow little face that rarely seemed pleased with anything at all. Her eyes were sharp and watchful, and her mouth had the habit of turning downward whenever the world did not arrange itself exactly how she wished. And very often, it did not. Mary had been born in India, where the sun burned hot and bright through most of the year. The heat made her tired, and she had been a delicate child almost from the very beginning. Because of this, she spent much of her time indoors, away from the dust and the glare of the roads outside the garden walls. Her father worked for the English government and was almost always busy with important matters that kept him far from the nursery. Her mother was beautiful. Everyone said so. She had soft, curling hair, delicate hands, and a wardrobe filled with the lightest and most elegant gowns. She loved laughter and music and long evenings filled with guests who talked and danced beneath the lanterns in the garden. What she did not love very much was the quiet responsibility of raising a little girl. So, from the very beginning, Mary was placed in the care of an ayah, a nurse whose job it was to watch the child and keep her out of sight whenever visitors arrived. The ayah understood her instructions perfectly. If the Mem Sahib was pleased, everything in the household moved smoothly. And so, the servants made certain that Mary had whatever she demanded, whenever she demanded it. If she cried, she was comforted immediately. If she shouted, people hurried to obey. If she insisted upon something unreasonable, it was given to her without question. No one ever told her no, and because of this, Mary grew up knowing very little about kindness, patience, or sharing with others. She only knew that the world should bend around her wishes. And by the time she was 6 years old, she had become a small, thin child with a sharp temper and a lonely heart, though she would never have described it that way. To Mary, the servants were simply people who appeared when she called and disappeared when she no longer needed them. She did not know how to play with other children. She had never learned how. And so most days, she wandered alone through the shaded corners of the garden and sat quietly beneath the veranda while the hot wind stirred the leaves of the trees. Sometimes, she watched the bright birds dart between the branches. Sometimes, she listened to the faraway sounds of the city beyond the walls. But very often, she simply sat in silence, frowning at the world. Because although Mary Lennox had many servants, a beautiful house, and everything she could possibly demand, there was one thing she did not have. She had no one who truly cared for her. And in the stillness of that sunlit house in India, a strange and quiet morning was already beginning to unfold. One that would change Mary's life forever. Mary Lennox didn't grow up the way most children do. She had no brothers or sisters to quarrel with in the garden, no companions who laughed beside her beneath the trees, and no gentle voice that patiently taught her how to share, forgive, or play kindly with others. Instead, she lived among servants. From the earliest days of her life, people had hurried to obey her wishes. If Mary pointed at something, someone fetched it. If she complained, someone tried to soothe her. If she demanded attention, the servants bowed their heads and tried to please her so quickly so that her mother, the beautiful Mem Sahib, would not be disturbed by the sound of a child crying. And so, Mary grew accustomed to being obeyed. It never occurred to her that the world might work in any other way. When she was old enough, an English governess was brought to the house to teach her letters and numbers as proper English children must learn. The young woman arrived with books and neat writing paper, and she spoke to Mary in a careful, patient voice. But patience was not something Mary understood. If the lesson bored her, she turned her head away. If she was corrected, she grew angry. If the governess tried to insist upon proper manners, Mary flew into such sharp, furious tempers that the poor woman soon found that her days became unbearable. Within 3 months, the governess packed her trunks and left the house. Another came, and then another, but none of them stayed long. Each time, the pattern was the same. Mary scowled. Mary argued. Mary refused to listen. And after a few unhappy weeks, the governess would disappear just as quietly as she had arrived. The servants, who had never dared deny Mary anything, only shook their heads and whispered to one another that the little Missy Sahib had a most difficult temper. And they were not wrong. By the time Mary was 9 years old, she had grown thin and pale from the heat of India and the long hours spent indoors. Her yellow hair hung straight against her cheeks, and her expression, so often displeased, made people hesitate before speaking to her. She had learned how to order people about, but she had never learned how to love them. And so she lived alone, in a way that no child truly should. Most mornings began quietly. The sun rose early over the palm trees, filling the air with shimmering heat before the day had properly begun. The servants moved through the house preparing breakfast, sweeping the floors, and opening the wide windows so the breeze could drift through the rooms. Mary usually awoke when her ayah came softly into the nursery. The ayah helped her dress, brushed her hair, and brought her breakfast. Sometimes she told Mary stories, old stories from her own childhood, about kings and princesses and mischievous spirits that wandered the forests at night. Mary liked the stories, though she would never admit it. She listened in silence, sitting stiffly in her chair, pretending that she was not interested at all. But when the ayah finished speaking, Mary would often say sharply, "Tell another." And the ayah, who understood children far better than Mary's mother ever had, would hide a smile and begin again. It might have seemed to someone watching from afar that the house ran smoothly enough. The servants did their work, Mary was cared for, the Mem Sahib attended her parties and dinners and afternoon visits, yet beneath the quiet order of the household, something fragile and uncertain always lingered in the air. Perhaps it was the restless heat. Perhaps it was the distance between the parents and their child. Or perhaps it was simply the lonely silence that filled the nursery when the stories ended and the servants slipped away. Mary never thought about these things. She only knew that the world belonged to her, and that she expected it to behave exactly how she wished. But one morning soon, she would awaken to discover that the world had changed in a way she could have never imagined. One morning, when Mary Lennox was about 9 years old, she woke feeling more cross than usual. The sun had already risen high enough to send warm light through the thin curtains of the nursery windows, and the air inside from the room felt thick and heavy, as though the day had begun long before she opened her eyes. Normally, by this time, her ayah would have already been there. The familiar routine never changed. The ayah would slip quietly into the room, open the shutters, and begin preparing Mary for the day. But this morning, something was different. Mary sat up in the bed and waited. The house was strangely quiet. For a few moments she listened, expecting to hear the soft rustle of her nurse's clothing or the gentle sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. Nothing came. Her mouth tightened. Mary did not like to wait. At last the door opened and a servant entered the room. But it was not her ayah. It was a different woman entirely, someone Mary had seen only once or twice before in the house. The servant moved quickly and nervously, her dark eyes flicking toward Mary with an uneasy expression. Mary's temper rose at once. "Why did you come?" she demanded sharply. "I will not let you stay. Send my ayah to me." The servant looked startled, almost frightened. She folded her hands together nervously and murmured something in a low voice Mary could not quite understand. "The ayah cannot come," she said at last. Mary's face flushed hot with anger. Cannot come? No one had ever told her such a thing before. "Send her immediately to me," Mary snapped, with her voice growing louder. But the servant only shook her head again, backing towards the door as though she wished to escape the room as quickly as possible. Something strange was happening in the house. Mary could feel it. Even a child, as self-absorbed as she was, could sense that the morning had taken on an unfamiliar, uneasy feeling. The halls beyond the nursery did not sound the way they usually did. Servants were moving about, but not in their usual calm manner. From somewhere, farther down the corridor, came the hurried sound of footsteps, followed by the quick opening and closing of doors. Once or twice, Mary heard voices speaking in low, anxious tones. Then just as suddenly, the sound stopped again. The silence returned. Mary climbed out of bed, her small bare feet touching the cool floor. She stood there for a moment, frowning towards the doorway, as if the house itself had become an irritating puzzle. Where was everyone? Why had her ayah not come? And why were the servants behaving in such a curious way? Mary did not like mysteries. She preferred the world to arrange itself neatly around her wishes. And when it did not, she grew furious. "Pig," she muttered angrily under her breath, thinking of the ayah who had not appeared. "Pig! Daughter of pigs!" It was the worst insult she knew. Still, no one came. Mary waited for a longer time, growing more impatient with every passing minute. At last, tired of the strange quiet inside the house, she wandered out through the veranda doors into the garden. The air outside shimmered with heat. The garden was bright with flowers, deep red hibiscus blossoms hanging heavy on their branches, and tall palms casting long shadows across the pale earth. Mary crouched beneath one of the trees and began poking little holes into the soil with a stick. She pretended she was making a flower bed. One by one she plucked the bright hibiscus blossoms and stuck them in the dirt, arranging them in neat little clusters. All the while she muttered to herself about the things she would say to the ayah when she returned. Because, of course, the ayah would return. Mary could imagine no other possibility. But as the minutes passed beneath the blazing sun, and the strange hush continued to hang over the house behind her, something deeper and more troubling slowly began to unfold inside the quiet bungalow. Though Mary did not know it yet, a terrible illness had come to the city, and before the day was over, it would change everything. Mary remained in the garden for some time, crouched beneath the thin shade of the tree. The morning had grown brighter, and the heat pressed gently against the earth, warming the stones of the veranda and the white walls of the house. Bees drifted lazily between the flowers, and somewhere, in the branches above her, a small bird chirped, once or twice, before falling quiet again. But the house behind her did not sound the way it usually did. There was something unsettled about it. Servants moved in hurried bursts along the veranda. Doors opened and closed more quickly than usual. Once or twice, Mary saw someone cross the courtyard with an anxious step, speaking in low voices to another servant before disappearing again inside. It made her uneasy. Mary didn't understand why. She simply knew that the rhythm of the morning had changed. She poked the earth again with her stick, pressing another scarlet hibiscus blossom into the dirt. Then suddenly, a sound broke through the stillness. It was a wail. A long, sorrowful cry rose from somewhere near the servants' quarters at the far end of the compound. The sound was strange and wild, carrying across the garden like a gust of wind through the trees. Mary froze. She had heard servants cry before, of course, but never like this. This cry was different. It was the sound of many voices together, rising and falling in mournful chorus. The little girl slowly stood. From where she stood, she could see the veranda doors of the house standing open, the thin curtains inside them stirring softly in the hot air. And just then, her mother stepped outside. The Mem Sahib moved quickly onto the veranda, her light dress floating around her as she walked. Her face, usually so calm and beautiful, looked pale and troubled. Beside her stood a young English officer Mary had seen once or twice before. He was tall and fair, and his uniform was still crisp despite the heat of the morning. They spoke together in low voices. Mary edged a little closer through the garden so she could hear them. "Is it very bad?" her mother asked, her voice strained and anxious. "Very bad," the young officer quietly repeated. "Very bad indeed." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "You should have gone to the hills weeks ago." Mary watched as her mother lifted her hands in distress. "I meant to," she said, "but there were so many engagements and that dreadful dinner party." Before she could finish speaking, another cry rose from the servants' quarters. This time, it was louder. The wailing voices seemed to sweep across the compound like a wave, echoing through the garden and along the veranda. Mary's mother clutched suddenly at the officer's arm. "What is it?" she gasped. "What has happened?" The officer turned his head toward the distant huts. His expression had grown grave. "Someone has died," he said quietly. Mary felt a strange chill pass through her, though the air was still heavy with heat. The officer looked back at Mrs. Lennox. "You did not say that the illness had broken out among your servants." "I did not know," she cried. "How could I know?" Without another word, she turned and hurried back into the house, the young officer following quickly behind her. For a few moments, the veranda stood empty again. The garden returned to its uneasy silence. Mary remained where she was, staring toward the house. She didn't understand what had just happened, but she could feel that something serious, something frightening, had begun to spread through the quiet bungalow. Inside the house, doors began opening and closing more rapidly now. Servants rushed along the corridors, their voices low and urgent. The wailing continued in the distance, and though Mary did not yet know the word for it, a terrible illness had already begun its silent work throughout the city. By nightfall, many people would be sick. By morning, some would already be gone. And before long, the strange hush that had settled over the house would deepen into something far more frightening. A silence that would leave Mary Lennox more alone than she had ever been in her life. As the morning wore on, the strange uneasiness in the house grew deeper. Mary wandered back towards the veranda, expecting someone to appear and explain what was happening. But the long, shaded corridor was empty. No servants hurried past her. No voices called from the rooms beyond. The house, which was usually alive with quiet movement, now seemed to be holding its breath. Mary stepped inside. Her small shoes made soft sounds against the cool tiled floor as she walked along the hallway toward the nursery. The curtains at the window lifted and fell gently in the warm breeze, and the familiar scent of jasmine drifted faintly in from the garden. But something had changed. The silence felt different now. Not peaceful, not calm. It was the kind of silence that made a person pause in the middle of a room and listen carefully, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. Mary didn't like it. She walked more quickly down the corridor, and when she reached the nursery, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Her bed stood neatly against the wall. The small writing desk was still covered with the books her governess had once tried to make her read. A doll lay forgotten in the corner, half hidden beneath the curtains of the toy cupboard. Mary looked around the room with a frown. Where was everyone? The ayah had still not come. No one had brought her breakfast. No one had told her what all the strange noise and crying had meant. And no one had come to see whether she needed anything at all. Mary's temper rose again. She stamped one foot impatiently against the floor. Pig, she muttered angrily to herself, thinking once more of the ayah who had failed to appear. But the angry word did not make her feel any better. The house remained quiet. Minutes passed, then more minutes. At last Mary wandered out of the nursery again and into one of the larger rooms of the bungalow. The dining room door stood half open. Inside, the long table was set from the morning meal. A few plates remained where they had been left. A glass of wine stood nearly full beside one of the chairs, and a bowl of fruit rested untouched in the center of the table. It looked as though the people who had been eating there had risen suddenly and left the room without finishing their breakfast. Mary stepped cautiously inside. She didn't understand why no one had cleared the table, but she was hungry, so she climbed into one of the chairs and helped herself to a piece of fruit and several biscuits from a nearby plate. The wine in the glass looked sweet and inviting in the sunlight. Mary lifted it carefully and took a sip. It tasted pleasant, much sweeter than anything she had been given before. She drank a little more. Soon, the warmth of the day and the quiet stillness of the house began to make her feel strangely sleepy. Mary climbed down from the chair and wandered slowly back toward the nursery. The silence of the bungalow wrapped around her like a warm blanket. From somewhere far away, she thought she heard voices calling, and once or twice the faint echo of footsteps outside the compound. But the sounds seemed distant now. The strange sweetness of the wine made her eyelids grow heavy. By the time she reached her bed, she could barely keep her eyes open. Mary curled up beneath the thin coverlet and closed her eyes. Outside the bungalow, confusion and fear were spreading quickly through the city. Servants were fleeing their homes. Doctors hurried from house to house, and the terrible sickness that had begun in the crowded streets was now moving silently through the quiet compound where Mary Lennox slept. But Mary knew nothing of it. The little girl slept deeply throughout the long, troubled hours that followed. And when she woke again, the world she knew would be gone. Mary slept for a long time. The heat of the afternoon slowly softened into the stillness of the evening, and the strange quiet that settled over the bungalow deepened even further. Yet, the little girl remained undisturbed. Now and then, distant sounds drifted through the compound, voices raised in alarm, hurried footsteps crossing the courtyard, the faint rumble of carts moving along the road beyond the walls. But Mary heard none of it. The sweetness of the wine and the heavy warmth of the day held her fast in sleep. When at last she stirred, the light in the room had changed. The bright gold of the afternoon sun had faded, and the shadows in the nursery stretched long and pale across the floor. Mary opened her eyes slowly. For a moment, she simply lay there, staring at the ceiling as if she could not quite remember where she was. Then she pushed herself up onto one elbow and listened. The house was perfectly still. Mary had never known it to be so quiet before. Usually, even the calmest hours of the day, she could hear something. The soft voices of servants in the hall, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, or the faint murmur of people moving through the veranda rooms. But now, there was nothing. Not a single voice, not a single footstep. Mary swung her legs out of bed and stood up. The floor felt cool beneath her feet. She walked slowly across the nursery and pushed the door open. The hallway beyond lay empty. A thin breeze drifted through the windows, stirring the curtains so they lifted and fell like a quiet breathing. Mary frowned. "Where is everyone?" she said out loud. Her voice sounded oddly loud in the silent corridor. She wandered down the hall and into the sitting room. The chairs stood neatly where they had been left. A book lay open on a small table, as though someone had been reading it only a short time before. But no one was there. Mary moved from one room to another, opening doors and peering inside. Everywhere she went, she found the same strange emptiness. The dining room still held the remains of the morning meal. The veranda door stood open to the garden, but the house itself felt deserted. Mary did not feel frightened exactly. She had spent much of her life alone, and solitude was not unfamiliar to her. Still, something about the quiet made her uneasy. She wandered back toward the nursery and paused suddenly. A faint rustling sound came from the floor. Mary looked down. Slipping quietly across the woven matting was a snake, a small snake, its smooth body gliding quickly toward the doorway. It paused for only a moment, lifting its tiny head as if to look at her. The creature's eyes shone like little dark jewels. Mary watched it without alarm. She had seen many small snakes in the garden before, and she knew they were harmless. The snake slipped easily beneath the door and disappeared into the hallway. Mary stood there for a moment longer, listening again to the strange stillness. "How quiet it is," she murmured to herself. "It sounds as if there were no one in the house but me and the snake." Almost as soon as she said the words, footsteps sounded outside in the compound. Mary turned quickly toward the veranda. Voices followed by footsteps, low, unfamiliar voices speaking English. A few moments later, the veranda doors opened and several men entered the bungalow. They moved cautiously through the rooms, speaking to one another in hushed tones. "What a desolate place," one of them said. "That pretty woman, I suppose, is gone too." "I heard there was a child," another voice replied, "though no one ever seemed to see her." Mary stepped forward into the hallway just as they opened the nursery door. The men stopped abruptly. For a moment, None of them spoke. They simply stared. Mary stood in the middle of the room, thin and pale, her hair hanging untidily around her face. Her expression had grown cross again. She was hungry, and she felt very much neglected. One of the men, a tall officer Mary had seen once before with her father, looked so startled that he almost stepped backward. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "There's a child here." And another man came forward quickly. "A child?" he repeated. "Alone?" Mary drew herself up stiffly. "I am Mary Lennox," she announced. Her voice held the sharp dignity she used whenever she felt insulted. "I fell asleep when everyone had the cholera," she continued. "And I have only just awakened." She stamped her foot impatiently. "Why does nobody come?" The men exchanged uneasy glances. One of them turned to the others and said quietly, "It's the child no one ever saw. She has actually been forgotten." For a moment, Mary simply stared at the men. Their faces had changed in a way she did not understand. They looked at her with an expression that was not quite fear and not quite pity, but something softer and more uncertain. Mary did not like that look at all. She preferred people to obey her or to leave her alone. "Why was I forgotten?" she demanded, stamping her foot sharply against the floor. "Why does nobody come?" The officer who had spoken first stepped forward a little. He was a tall man with tired eyes, and the dust of the long road still clung to the shoulders of his uniform. For a moment, he didn't answer. He seemed to be searching for the right words. The men behind him shifted uneasily, and the last one of them spoke quietly. "The poor child," he murmured. "She must not understand." Mary's face grew red with anger. "I understand everything," she said sharply. "No one has come all day." The officer knelt down slightly so that he could look at her more closely. Up close, Mary appeared even thinner than she had seemed at first. Her pale hair hung untidily around her face, and there were faint shadows beneath her eyes from the long sleep. She looked cross. She also looked very small. "Poor little kid," the officer said softly. "There is no one left to come." Mary frowned. She did not immediately understand what he meant. "No one left?" she repeated. The words sounded strange in the quiet nursery. The officer hesitated before answering. "The sickness," he said gently. "It spread very quickly." Mary watched him, waiting. The room seemed unusually still. "The cholera came to this house," he continued. "Your ayah fell during the night, and the servants," he paused, "many of them died." Mary's expression did not change. She had heard the word cholera before that morning, but it had never meant very much to her. It was simply a word adults spoke when they wanted children to stay indoors. "And my mother?" Mary asked. The officer lowered his gaze for a moment. "Your mother and father became ill yesterday," he said quietly. "They were taken away during the night." The words settled slowly into the room. Mary blinked once. She didn't cry. She didn't even look particularly surprised. She had never spent much time with her parents, and the idea of them being gone did not immediately feel different from the way things had always been. But the officer's voice grew even softer. "They have died," he finished gently. For a long moment, Mary said nothing at all. The men waited. The house remained silent around them. At last, Mary spoke again. "But someone must come," she insisted stubbornly. "Someone always comes." The officer glanced at the other men. Then he shook his head slowly. "The servants who survived fled the house with the sickness spread," he said. "They were frightened. Everyone left as quickly as they could." Mary stood very still. The strange quiet of the bungalow suddenly seemed to grow even deeper. She remembered the empty rooms, the abandoned breakfast table, the way the house had felt as though they were waiting. That was why. She had been forgotten. Not on purpose, but forgotten all the same. She had slept while the house emptied around her. She had slept while the last people in her world disappeared. And now, as the evening shadows lengthened across the nursery floor, Mary Lennox stood in the middle of the quiet room, with the small snake gone beneath the door, and the strange men watching her. For the first time in her life, there truly was no one left who belonged to her at all. The men did not remain in the bungalow very long after that. There was little left for them to do. The house had already been abandoned by most of its servants, and the illness had driven the rest of the household away in fear. Outside, in the compound, the air still held a strange, unsettled quiet, as though the place itself were slowly emptying. Mary Lennox was taken away that same evening. One of the officers lifted her gently into a waiting carriage. She did not protest, though she sat stiffly beside him with her small hands folded tightly in her lap. She had never left the compound alone before. The road beyond the garden walls looked different from what she had imagined. The city seemed restless and uncertain. People moved quickly through the streets, and the distant sound of voices drifted through the warm air. Here and there doors stood shut, and windows had been closed tightly against the sickness spreading through the crowded neighborhoods. Mary watched it all in silence. No one had explained very much to her. She only knew that the bungalow had been left behind. The carriage carried her to the home of an English clergyman and his wife who lived not far from the city. They were kind people, though they were also very busy. Their house was filled with children, so many children that Mary had difficulty remembering all their names. The room seemed crowded and noisy compared to the quiet bungalow she had left behind. Young voices echoed in the hallways, and the sound of running feet often followed the laughter of games she did not understand. Mary didn't join them. She stood apart and watched. The other children quickly decided that she was a curious little creature. She was pale and thin. She rarely smiled. And she had the habit of looking at people with a sharp expression that made them feel as though they had done something wrong. One afternoon, while the children were playing together in the garden, one of the older girls began skipping rope and singing a rhyme in a cheerful voice. The others joined in, clapping their hands to the rhythm. Mistress Mary, quite contrary, how does your garden grow? With silver bells and cockle shells and marigolds all in a row. Mary stood at the edge of the garden and listened. The rhyme annoyed her. She didn't understand why they were laughing. The clergyman's wife soon realized that Mary did not mix well with the others. She is a most unhappy child, she told her husband quietly one evening, and she makes the other children uneasy. Her husband nodded thoughtfully. It cannot be helped, he said. She has been through a very strange time. The clergyman's wife sighed. We cannot keep her here long, she said gently. Our house is already so full. So letters were written, and before many days had passed, a decision was made about Mary Lennox's future. Mary herself was told very little. She only heard that she would soon be leaving India. She was to travel across the sea to England, where a relative that she had never met would take charge of her. An uncle, a man named Mr. Archibald Craven. Mary listened to this news without much interest. She had never heard of her uncle before. The name meant nothing to her, but the clergyman's wife spoke of him in a curious expression. They say he lives in a very large house, she explained, in a house called Misselthwaite Manor. Mary did not know what a manor was, but she imagined something grand and distant. Where is it? She asked. On the Yorkshire moors, the woman replied. It's a lonely place, I believe. Mary did not mind the sound of that. Lonely places were the only kind she had ever really known. Before many days had passed, Mary Lennox found herself leaving India. The journey began quietly. Early one morning, she was taken to the harbor, where a large ship waited in the pale light of dawn. The air smelled of salt and warm wind, and the sea stretched endlessly beyond the docks, shimmering beneath the rising sun. Mary stood beside the clergyman's wife, holding a small traveling bag. She had very little with her. Most of the things that had once belonged to her had been left behind in the silent bungalow. It didn't trouble her very much. Mary had never been particularly attached to objects, and she had never stayed in one place long enough to feel that anything truly belonged to her. Still, as the ship's whistle sounded and the gangway was lowered, she turned once and looked back toward the distant shoreline. India had been the only home she had ever known. The bright gardens, the white veranda, the slow, heavy heat of the mornings, all of it was slipping quietly behind her now. The voyage across the sea lasted many days. Mary spent most of the time wandering the deck of the ship or sitting alone near the railing, watching the water stretch endlessly toward the horizon. The ocean fascinated her. Sometimes the waves rolled gently, glimmering beneath the sunlight like fields of moving glass. Other days, the wind rose and the water darkened, lifting and falling in long, restless swells. Mary said very little to anyone. She was still a thin, solemn child, and the strangers aboard the ship often glanced at her with curiosity before returning to her own conversations. But Mary did not mind their silence. She had grown accustomed to being alone. At last, the ship reached England. The change in the air was immediate. The warm brightness of India had vanished, replaced by cool gray skies and a wind that seemed to drift across the land from distant hills. Mary wrapped her coat more tightly around herself as she stepped onto the dock. The world here felt quieter. The light was softer. Even the trees seemed different, taller and darker, with branches that swayed gently beneath the pale sky. From the harbor, she was placed on a train that would carry her north. The countryside passed slowly outside the windows. Green fields stretched across the landscape, divided by hedges, stone walls. Small villages appeared now and then, their cottages clustered together beneath the curling trails of chimney smoke. Mary watched it all with steady curiosity. The land seemed endless. Hour after hour, the train traveled farther away from the coast, carrying her toward the northern hills, toward the place where her uncle lived, toward Misselthwaite Manor. The name itself seemed mysterious. The clergyman's wife had spoken of it in a thoughtful voice, as though the house were not quite like other houses. A very large place, she had said. An old place, and very lovely. Mary didn't know what she would find there. She didn't know what sort of man her uncle might be. But as the train rolled deeper into the quiet countryside, the sky slowly darkening above the distant hills, it seemed to Mary that the world ahead of her was growing wider and stranger with every passing mile. Somewhere beyond those hills stood the great house called Misselthwaite Manor, a house with many rooms, long corridors, hidden corners, and though Mary could not yet imagine it yet, a locked garden that had been sleeping quietly for many years, waiting for someone to discover it. And now, as Mary Lennox's long journey carries her across the quiet countryside of England, the evening settles gently over the hills. The train moves steadily north, past green fields and winding hedgerows, toward a distant and lonely place called Misselthwaite Manor. Mary does not yet know what waits for her there. She doesn't know about the long corridors of the great house, or the wind that drifts softly across the wide Yorkshire moors. And she certainly doesn't know about the garden. A garden that has been locked for many years. A garden that sleeps quietly behind hidden walls, waiting for someone to discover it. But that is a story for another evening. For now, let the quiet rhythm of the journey carry your thoughts gently onward. The train rolls through the darkening countryside. The wind moves softly across the hills, and somewhere, far ahead, beneath the wide English sky, Misselthwaite Manor waits in silence. Sleep now. You are safe. You are loved. You've been listening to Nicki Cozy Stories, written and narrated by Nicole T. Woodard. May your dreams be gentle and your sleep be deep.